Sorry, Judy.
Welcome everyone to the meeting of the Overview and Scrutiny Committee. I'd particularly like to welcome the Chief Executive, Councillors Bainham and Mercer, our Cabinet members who are coming. I'd like to welcome the Chief Executive, who's coming for one of the items, and Councillors Bainham and Mercer, who are Cabinet members, and also the directors who are here and officers. First item on the agenda is apologies. Apologies for absence.
Thank you. We have apologies from Sam Bateman, Councillor Sam Bateman, and Councillor Nick Grant.
Thank you. Are there any other apologies? No? Next item on the agenda is minutes. The item here is to approve the minutes. However, having said that, there was an error or a mistype in the original minutes as sent out. Since then, the person who made the comment has come back with a proposed correction. The original, on page 4, the penultimate paragraph essentially was the work was being undertaken in relation to women and girls who may interest and value to those who identify as gender neutral. Comment was made to correct that to same thing, but interest and value to those who do not identify within their assigned gender. So that's a proposed change to the agenda. I will propose in a seconder. Do you agree to this change to the minutes? Councillor Livingston, thank you. Councillor Perry, thank you. Can we amend the minutes slightly? Apart from that, can we approve the minutes as they stand? Thank you. Can I have a propose and seconder? Thank you, John. Thank you, Len. Yeah. So there's also a set of minutes for the 8th of May, which basically is just when we started off the Overview and Scrutiny. Can I have a proposal and a seconder for these? Thank you, Councillor Taylor. Councillor Vickers. Item 3, declarations of members' interests. Any declarations? No. Announcements. And no announcements to the Chief Executive. There were 2 other items which could have come to committee, but I decided not to bring them forward. One was to do with charging for biodiversity net gain works, which we covered at a PDAG. I thought the agenda was heavy enough as it is for us to work through. Next item on the agenda is item 5, which is a report on the Council's finance and performance. Now you will have seen that circulated prior to this meeting that there was a whole raft of questions which applies to this and other topics on the agenda. So some of these the officers will address, not all of them because you already have the detail, but this is your opportunity to ask questions over and beyond those questions, if I can put it that way. Tom?
Thank you. So I appreciate that there are about 75 pages of the outturn report of 23-24. So there's a lot of detail and information in there. I'll try and summarise that as best I can and give you the highlights, if you like, in 5 areas. So we've got revenue and capital, we've got reserves, performance, and the annual plan and projects. So we'll start with revenue. So the good news, I suppose, is we've produced a revenue surplus for the year. So 220,000 after allowing for budgets of £135,000 carried over for consultancy work on the local plan that got delayed. And to put that into some context, there are many other authorities out there who have been in deficit in the year, so I think that is a good position to be in. So that's the first bit of information. We're doing okay. But, and with me, there's always a sort of a but and a downside to things. It's a much smaller surplus than in previous years, and that's the important bit here. And we've got some key areas of overspend that you'll see in some of the appendices, which I'd just like to draw your attention to note the significance of this. And they're in a couple of areas, and revenues and benefits being one of them, both the administration of that, as we try and improve the quality, and the housekeeping after COVID, and also the cost of living crisis where we've been asked to do extra work, and also in the benefit payment side. So on the subsidy, and that's not just the subsidy loss where we have made errors, but it's also to do with things like a supported accommodation cap where we don't get as much income as our expenditure, and the move to universal credits migration, which will reduce the amount of overpayments that we can recover. So 2 key areas there, and we've also got other things, haven't we, that are affecting income, so water neutrality, affecting development and building control, and we've also got, other one-off things in the year, which you're going to get in a year. So, for example, a rent reduction in the investment properties that affected 1 year only. And I suppose, why highlight these? Well, these are pressures from 23-24, that some of them will flood through into 24-25. Now, when we set the 24-25 budget, we've tried to estimate the impact as we knew it at probably about month 8 or 9. And sometimes it's only towards the end of the year does the full impact actually come through. And I see, perhaps 700 or 800,000 pounds worth of expenditure there, mainly in the benefits area, but also in the income bit, on water neutrality, that will affect how we do in 24-25. So there's a bit of pressure in the system there that's going to build up. And when we look ahead further already to 25-26 and setting that budget, and I know that seems an awful long way away, January and February next year, there's a bit of pressure coming through here. So we've got that £700,000-800,000 from 23-24 that will flood through. We've got £600,000 that we used from one-off grants to fund 24-25, so we're already starting behind the curve. And every year, expenditure goes up quicker than income. So there's another roughly £500,000 worth of cost pressure there as well to find. There is a little bit of good news in terms of the budget that we've set in 24-25, anticipated a slightly higher salary increase than the figures that are currently on the table. Now, I should stress that they're currently, because it hasn't been agreed yet, but the offer on the table is 2.5%, and we've sort of budgeted for 3.88%. So there's a bit of headroom there to net off that. But we're still looking at a total of around about 1.5 million, 1.6 million pounds to find when we set 25-26. So although we're doing okay from 23-24, 24-25 I think will be difficult to achieve a surplus, and we're looking at 25-26 already and thinking that's a problem. Now, the good news is obviously we're only just in June, and work has already kicked off with our officers and heads of service have been tasked with looking at options to find savings in expenditure and ways in which to grow our income to cover that. We've got a cabinet, an SLT away day next week coming up, where we'll talk about the options that are there and the sorts of decisions that we might have to make. looking ahead. So whilst it's, good news from the report that it's in front of you, there's a bit of pressure building in the system. Any questions on the revenue side at all?
Councillor Walters?
Thank you, Chair. My understanding was that it was always predicted that we would be in a possible deficit for those years going forward. So how far are we out with that in mind?
Do you mean beyond 25, 26?
No.
Or-
It was probably about 2-3 years ago when we were discussing the budgets and whatnot, that it was predicted that we would be in a loss situation at some point. And I'm sure that was either this year, next year, or the year after. So the question is, how much difference is there? What's the additional negative pressure? If you like, or how many millions is it? 1 million? Is it 1.2 against what was 300,000? Or do you know those figures?
I understand the question. It's very difficult, though, to give you a really easy answer to that, because each year we try and correct our course. So we will take action every year as we set the budget, and we will try and squeeze out the 500,000 costs that increase each year. So we've already taken action in some things, and other things will have gone up a bit higher than we thought. So, for example, the revenues and benefits pressures are stronger than we thought this time last year that they would be. We always seem to have, don't we, a budget deficit looming, but we keep taking action to change it. And I see this as no different, really. We're still taking action, we will be taking action to close that gap. I just think it's a little bit stronger in a shorter period away, if that makes sense. So previously, the budget gap has been 2 or 3 years hence. We've now sort of reached the stage where it's a year ahead hence, and we're talking quite a big number there to find. However, the officers will be beavering away to try and close that. And if you look at areas where we can increase things, and it might not be palatable to put parking charges up, for example, but that's a lever that you can pull to close that gap. So there are things that we can do. It will require some difficult decisions. And we're never really going to get out of this situation unless we get, some proper guaranteed funding from government. And the difficulty is we've still got a situation where they give us 1 year at a time in advance, and we never quite know whether the one-off temporary grants that they call one-off temporary grants are temporary or whether we'll get those permanently. And at the moment, they're still classing them as one-off and temporary. We have to assume, therefore, that they'll be taken away.
Thank you very much for that very clear explanation.
Any other questions? Councillor Circus?
On this question of what the government does or doesn't do, there is, of course, a slight possibility that there might be a change of government.
Possibly. Just possibly.
In which case, the whole picture of government support, or the absence of government support, might change dramatically. And I suppose, to some extent, we're completely in the dark as to what the new local government financial regime is going to look like. And one of the things, perhaps Dominic or somebody can comment on, we do know that a Labour government would be interested in a concordat with working people in terms of rights, employment rights. Now, the thing about employment rights is that I'm not speaking in favour or against these additional employment rights, but all employment rights have a cost. And of course, that could throw out our calculations quite considerably. I don't know whether in the very uncertain situation, well, perhaps it isn't that uncertain really, that we're in at the moment, whether Dominic has any views on that situation.
I don't have a value that I can place on that. But you're absolutely right to draw attention to the risk that it could be quite significant. And I suspect it's probably not factored in greatly at the moment. So it could worsen the situation quite considerably. Obviously, we would want to see exactly what it entails and the sort of guidance that comes out to be able to then crunch it through the sausage machine and find an answer at the end of it. So,
Councillor Vickers?
Just an observation, I think there are a lot more councils in a much worse position than we currently are in. And we should be grateful for that we are in a much better position than many. So, I mean, that's all going to be resolved in some form or other, I suspect, going forward. And who knows? I mean, yes, we're in uncertain times.
we are, and it could be a double-edged sword, actually, couldn't it? So if the cake doesn't get any bigger, it just gets sliced differently. We lose out for being a relatively very good performer. So,
Councillor Bainham, would you like to come in?
Yes, I just wanted to respond briefly to Councillor Circus, and he's entirely right. We are completely in the dark on what is likely to be coming our way. We may get a certain shedding of some light when the Labour publish their manifesto tomorrow, but I doubt we're going to get the kind of detail that we actually need. But once things become more clear, we will be working to adjust, and we have to be flexible towards that. We have no other choice, because at the end of it, come budget time next year, we will produce a balanced budget, because that's our legal responsibility to do so.
Thank you. Any other questions on the revenue side? I'll also mention that you've been circulated with the questions that were raised before the meeting, so you can always refer to those questions as well, because they might enlighten you a bit more as to what the numbers are about. There's quite a lot of detail in those questions from councillors around this table. I'll hand over back to Dom.
okay, I'll move on to capital. And paragraph 2.6 in the report sets out the performance, which I sort of liken to the Radio 4 shipping forecast, actually, in terms of some areas of performance moderate or good, occasionally poor, the forecast being overall fair and improving, in my view. So, and some showers, yeah. Okay, I'll touch on those in a moment, because there were some questions actually on the underspends of the capital that I might just cover off. But overall, 70%, inclusive of the sort of the local authority housing fund. If you just look at that sort of section of it, 79%, which is good. One section we got right at the end, which we didn't have any chance of spending because the government didn't tell us until the end of February, which now has a deadline of commitment before, I think it's the 31st of August. But everything else, if you exclude the housing fund, is 62%. Which is better than last year. So last year I looked up 43% last year. So I think we are heading in the right direction. And I think some of the actions that I've required and put in place have started to work. But I don't think that's a finished position. There's certainly room for improvement and refinement, and it's my job to make sure that we get that direction of travel continuing upwards towards 70% overall for everything. And that's my aim for this year. Although I'm just, hanging my own noose there for this time next year if I don't get that right. But I think we're heading in the right direction. Some of the underspends that I've listed out there, the 6 largest ones, they are slippage and they're not savings. So, we haven't not done something or we've come in under budget. It's a mixture of internal and external reasons. In the case of the ANPR system, for example, sensibly so. So we are reusing the equipment that's working now. We thought there might be a change of supplier. So we put a capital sum in there to be able to go, if there was a change in supplier. We haven't changed supplier, and therefore, we're continuing to use the same equipment, and that capital program of 250,000 will be spent as and when those pieces of equipment fail, or we need replacing or upgrading, etc. And that'll be over the next 2 or 3 years rather than in the financial year. So sometimes the reason is a good one. And if you look at some of the stuff that we haven't done, the parts side improvements that are in there, we've subsequently taken a decision that we won't need that. So actually sometimes not getting on with something early can have a sort of a good outcome as well. But the overall message is, better, but still not brilliant.
Any questions on capital, on CapEx? No? Let you off lightly.
Good. I'm just going to pass across to Sam to go through some of the other areas rather than just listening to me.
So next we have the reserves. So subject to the external audit, the reserves at the 31st of March totalled 46.4 million. This is compared to 49 million that we had at the 31st of March 2023 and a reduction of 2.6 million. There's a movement between the general fund and earmark reserves. So general fund reserves are down 3.7 million to 22.7 million, and earmark reserves are up 1.1 million to 23.7 million. The increase in earmark reserves is a combination of the annual payment for new homes bonus, which we put into the environment and infrastructure reserve, and we have created a cost of living reserve as well when we set the 23-24 budget. Are there any questions on reserves?
Well, apart from the ones that we submitted prior to the meeting, are there any supplementary questions, sorry? No? Okay.
So on to performance. There are 7 amber areas, 5 red areas, 2 of which are in housing, 1 is in communities and 2 are in waste. The 2 housing areas are the number of households in temporary accommodation and another KPI for bed and breakfast accommodation. There's been a 19% rise in temporary accommodation since 2021-22, and this reflects local and national trends. As the report has indicated and mentioned under the capital programme element in the report, the options that would help increase the performance can be delayed by third parties. The communities one, so the number of voluntary organisations supported through advice and enablement is below target. This is largely down to internal resourcing issues, which have improved, and early signs in the first quarter of this year are that this will quickly recover. And finally, waste. We had adverse weather conditions, I think we all know that, that have contributed to a higher level of wet paper contamination in the recycling contamination rates. However, the annual figure remained above targets. This was just a blip. And the last one is fly tipping incidents. They continue to be above target, which follows, again, the national trend. We are working to reduce duplication within the reporting system, as well as land registry checks taking place as to where the fly tipping has occurred before a crew is sent out to take a look at it. And I'd also like to say that previously reporting and explaining multiple issues in revenues and benefits, this is Dom, it's pleasing to report that the improvements are taking hold and many of those have turned from amber to green. And one last thing on this, the late KPI from revenues and benefits, which is the council tax arrears collection, the figure is 36.14%, which is greater than last year's performance of 35.69%, which was also the target. And that's another green indicator for the report. Any questions on performance?
Councillor Kitchen?
Jim, can I just ask a question on fly tipping, which seems quite a small thing in this area, but I hate to say it's very close to my heart. Are we the only people who are responsible for paying for all this rubbish that's being dumped in farmers' fields, blocking roads and all that, or other agencies, are other agencies responsible as well?
Paul, do you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, if it's on public land, we're responsible. If it's on private land, it's the responsibility of the landowner to deal with the waste.
And nobody else, just purely local authority and landowners?
Yeah, there may be some situations where the Environment Agency would get involved if there was a major fly tipping incident, but primarily it's HDC or landowners.
Thank you, Chairman.
Presumably that includes county council land, we clear their rubbish as well. Yeah. Any other questions? Oh, Councillor Circus?
Thank you, Chairman. Not surprisingly, perhaps you'll think, I wanted to ask a couple of questions about waste. To take up the point that Liz raised, I know that, for example, Hampshire County Council is driving potentially very severe restrictions in the availability of civic amenity sites, including potentially closing anything up to 12 civic amenity sites. Now, when I spoke to the Cabinet member for West Sussex, they said, we are having the same discussion. Now, I hope in a way that if they are having the same discussion, they don't come to the worst possible scenario in terms of result. Because one of the things I learnt, and I'm sure Jay will confirm this, is the more difficult you make it to deposit waste legally, the more illegal deposit of waste you get. And therefore, I hope the administration will have a close eye on any review that we have here in West Sussex on waste disposal facilities, because if there's any further restrictions, the potential for a further increase in fly tipping is distinctly on the cards. The second thing I wanted to raise, if I may, I can't remember, when we talk about targets for contamination, of course, the thing about contaminated recycling is that all recycling is contaminated. If it wasn't, you wouldn't have any recycling. But the question is, what is the acceptable level? Now, I seem to remember we used to work, or the industry used to work on a figure of 6%, that anything more than a perceived contamination of more than 6% of a load meant the load got rejected and thrown away and lost from the point of view of recycling. So perhaps either Jay or Paul can give me a little bit of clarification over what we mean when we mean below target, above target, and what actually, in practical terms, is that target in terms of, I hate to say it, an acceptable level or a wearable level of contamination of loads. Thank you.
Paul, do you want
You're absolutely right. There's always contamination in recycling, and the acceptable level of contamination is essentially determined by the organisations that process the recycling, and that will change, and that is changing, and acceptable levels of contamination are falling in terms of it needs to be higher quality recyclate that we're taking to the material recovery facilities, so that they've got a market to sell it onto. I can't tell you precisely what that percentage is right now. I've got 4% in my mind, but it may be more generous than that.
Thank you, Paul. Do you want to come on as well, Councillor Mercer?
Well, if I can just comment on the fly tipping issue. I mean, obviously, I will follow up and see what I can find out about in relation to the county situation, though one should be aware, of course, that the vast number of, that the greatest proportion of fly tipping is actually commercial waste rather than domestic waste. So whilst we wouldn't want an increase in domestic waste tipping, it's not actually the pattern at the moment.
Please go ahead.
If the acceptable level of contamination is falling, in other words, we've got to achieve, a much better level, a lower level of contamination, is that likely to push us into moving away in the long run from mixed recyclates that we do quite successfully in West Sussex, as far as the MRF down at Ford is concerned. If we've got to achieve an ever lowering standard, if I can put it like that, in terms of what's acceptable in terms of contamination, is this going to end up with having to have separate containers for separate materials in order to achieve, in the long run, a potentially lower rate of contamination of recyclables?
I'll have a go at that, and if Paul could pick me up on the bits I get wrong, but
I'll make you
I'm not aware of any proposals from the county to change the MRF's operation, and clearly that's a very significant, as you visited, you know what it looks like. It's a very significant mechanical sorting machine building, and I guess any major changes would be tied into the changes needed around food waste, because clearly we have both the issues around the, shall we say, better quality anaerobic digestion that needs to happen, and also around the future collection of soft plastic, which of course is another major change, but that's not something that's been flagged up as far as I'm aware.
No, there's going to be no change to the recycling methodology in the foreseeable future. So the government made their simpler recycling announcements last year, and you'll remember there was talk in the media about us all needing 7 or 8 different bins, and the government were clear that there was no desire to introduce that in the UK. And in West Sussex, we do produce a high quality of recyclate, certainly when you compare to other authorities.
I can just chip in there from, Councillor Len Ellis-Ron. Okay, on this subject, basically, I mean, well, sorting out aluminium and tin cans is quite easy to do. I mean, when it comes to plastics, from my experience of the plastics and petrochemical industry, basically, the less contamination you have in the plastics, the better, because you can substitute virgin polymer by recycled polymer, and if it's clean, you can end up with higher end value products instead of using it for stuff like roads and stuff like that. So I would see that pressure continuing as a passing comment of having lower contamination, particularly amongst the plastics. Thanks. Councillor Jeffrey?
Thank you, Chair. Just on fly tipping again, I was looking at the figures. I noticed from the report that it says there's some instances of duplication. So I'm just wondering, essentially, how skewed are those figures? Have we looked into how many instances have been duplicated? Yes, and that's my question. Are these figures that we've got in front of us how significantly are they skewed, essentially, or do we know, or is that something we've investigated at all, is my question, I suppose?
Honestly, I don't know, but we are doing a piece of work to improve the quality of data that we record, so that we know that if we've got 3 Southwalls members reporting the same fly tip, we just record 1 fly tip. So that's a piece of work that's ongoing within the team.
Councillor Len Ellis-Brown?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for answering my question earlier. There's some add-ons to that, but we can deal with that separately. Just a question really, I think they're going to be reviewed anyway, the KPIs. I think we probably have too many. My other question is, or point, is that when setting the targets, are we considering the constraints that are placed on the council? You know, to achieve some of these targets may well be more costly than the benefits they derive from those. I know it doesn't paint a good picture in the community perhaps, but it's a question of how we sell those. You know, some of these targets, I think, to achieve them would be more costly than the benefits that are derived from them. And finally, that we are setting targets which are constants, which are measurable against a variable, and therefore we need to perhaps have a target that is within parameters rather than set as a constant.
Any comment, Don?
No, other than that, it's very helpful to hear, and you're absolutely right. We will be revisiting the performance indicators, and those sorts of comments are really useful. So we'll take that on board. Thank you.
Yeah, for what it's worth, I mean, I was quite concerned going through this report, looking at some of the performance indicators, that some of the targets, as you can see from the questions, seem to be soft in inverted commas and sandbagged almost. And it wasn't clear to me when we would review them and when we would look at them and adjust them in view of reality, if I can put it that way. I'm glad to hear we're going to be doing that. Thanks. Any other questions to do? Performance indicators? No? One more from Sam.
One more, last but not least, projects and annual plan. So Appendix G contains the commentary on the progress of the corporate projects, many of which are well underway. Some of them do straddle the arbitrary line of the financial year, so they continue into the new year. And in Appendix H, you will find the monitoring of the outturn of the annual plan for 2023-24. A healthy completion rate here, with the number where not completed are progressing well into this financial year. I'll take questions if anyone has
Thank you,
any.
Sam. Any questions on the outturn for Sam? No? Yeah. You're right. Absolutely. Next item on the agenda is parking policy update. You were all circulated with a wad of papers to give you an idea of the history behind this particular topic, insofar that over the previous task and finish groups have looked at the parking and the pattern of parking for new developments, came to a conclusion on some of the work, went to council. But of course, we have a local plan to consider, which is going to examination. So I've asked Catherine several months ago to come back to this committee, and we'll issue her with a standing invitation to come back again in several reiterations. But Catherine, do you want to field this one, please?
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Clark. Paul, you've stolen my introduction a little bit, but I was just going to mention really that I think you've had a pack that's come round to you, but I'm aware that obviously there's been some changes since I was to the committee membership since I was here in January. So I was just going to give a very high level overview, but essentially there are some county council guidelines or guidance on parking standards, and that was adopted by the county back in 2020. And actually around the same time there was then an overview and scrutiny task and finish group that were looking at parking standards themselves and suggested standards that could be applied to planning applications. Now, the issue that we have as planners is that when you are looking at planning parking standards, it needs to refer back to the MPPF and be evidence-based. Really the feedback that officers gave at that time was really that the standards which had come from the overview and scrutiny group needed to be sort of looked at from an evidence-based perspective. So what we did was to commission some consultants that reviewed the county standards in particular, and provided some other feedback on standards more generally, and looked to see how that could be incorporated into a supplementary planning document or an SPD. And in a nutshell, what that did was to conclude that actually most of the existing guidance, the standards that are around that have been used are acceptable, and a lot of it also comes into the, how development is designed as well. But certainly what they have picked up on is that the standard in the town centre of Horsham itself does look to be a bit too low. And I think the other point is that some of the issues that had been picked up by the Overview Scrutiny as task and finish group back in 2020, they were looking at, there certainly were issues with car parking standards, but obviously we're looking at an earlier iteration and some of the issues that had arisen from an earlier iteration of car parking standards prior to the sort of 2020 version. So, as Councillor Clark has alluded to, any supplementary planning document, it needs to sort of effectively, sort of colloquial term, but hang off any sort of local plan policy as the basis for any guidance. And really to do that, therefore, we need an up-to-date local plan policy. And I think, as all of you know, we are in the midst of preparing a local plan. So we do have a draft policy, and that hadn't actually gone out for consultation when I was here last, which was just before we published the document. So that is policy 25 of the Regulation 19 plan. There is also some reference to parking standards in paragraph 8.18 of that document. But essentially, as I said, because we need that policy to be sort of agreed, we are quite connected in terms of what we do from an SPD to the local plan timetable. So in terms of the Regulation 19, we've certainly got to a position now where the officers have more or less got through all the recs, with about 1,700 in total. And we did receive some, albeit not a huge number, it was around about 15 sort of comments around the parking policy. But some of them did object in one way or another to the parking policy. So we have, interestingly, some particularly sort of some of our community groups, they would like the policy to go further and set sort of, more generous parking standards, if you like. We've got developers that are questioning whether we should even have, inverted commas, adequate parking standards, make of that what you will. And then the County Council have also identified a concern that we've put in that we would be looking at providing our own design guidance and parking guidance. They've raised concerns around that, interestingly. Irrespective of what we think about those comments, obviously that's really a matter for the local plan examination. What that does mean in practical terms is that now, because those comments have been raised, it is a matter that the local plan inspectors in due course will need to look at and consider as part of the examination process. So effectively, we've got a point where that policy is, in effect, it's in dispute in some way, shape or form. And so we're not in a position to say that actually there is an agreed policy position, whereas actually we do have, I think, one policy, I think, in the plan where no one has put any comments in at all, which probably means that we are in a position where going forwards we might be able to start using that more, it has more weight. So in terms of the local plan timetable, we are on track for submission just after the general election. So we are looking to submit in early July, and obviously once we get past that point of submission, we are in the hands of the planning inspectorate rather than ourselves in terms of setting the timetable. But what we are expecting to see is that we will receive something called matters, issues and questions from the planning inspectors or inspector in the autumn, so probably September, October time, and we'll have quite a strict timetable to respond to those. We are anticipating that the hearings will probably be in December. This is based on sort of feedback from our programme officers who sort of administer the programme based on their most recent experience of when we would see a hearing, but obviously that is something we'll find out for sure once we get to that point of submission. So in terms of when we're likely to sort of get more of a steer in terms of all the policies, not just the parking policies, we really are looking to either early 2025 when probably we'll get a an early letter from the inspectors in terms of any of the critical issues that come out of the examination. But they might be silent on some points, and it could be that they're silent on the parking if it's not a huge issue for discussion. And we would expect then to see their report, and therefore then the plan adoption in probably mid-2025. Clearly, the local plan examination process is hugely resource intensive. It's almost like running a number of planning and hearings or inquiries sort of concurrently, essentially. But I think it is something that we can keep under review in terms of, what are the outcomes of the examination, what do we hear, when. So that's something we'll keep an eye on. We obviously need to agree, any timetable for SPDs with the cabinet member as well. And I think this is a point that's already been raised by Councillor Serkis in relation to the previous item, but also we're aware that post-election there could potentially be changes to the planning system. That's something that has been flagged by some of the parties. There is also the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act, which came into force last year, which is looking to introduce some changes to the planning bill through secondary legislation. Interestingly, one of those is to withdraw supplementary planning guidance. That's not to say we wouldn't do parking guidance, but the tone of it might have to change. So those are things, again, that we also need to just keep on our radar. But I'll stop there and ask for questions.
Thanks, Catherine, for a comprehensive update. Any questions from members? Sorry, Councillor Kitchen.
Thank you for that, Catherine. Can I ask actually how much say we have over car parking on some of these areas, because the county council take it up, and how much does the inspector take it up? Because I think every single one of us is in this room who has a new build in their area, the car parking is totally and completely inadequate. I mean, if you look at Kilwood Vale and Mowbray, you can't drive two cars down one road now. There's not enough room because of the car parking. So do we as a planning authority have any say over it, or is it entirely the inspector?
So I suppose there's kind of two sort of slightly separate issues in terms of asking that question. So in terms of the planning policy itself, which is emerging, that's something that will be discussed through the local plan examination. But the planning policy is quite high level and just refers as a hook to the fact that there is guidance that exists in some way, shape or form. In terms of the actual guidance, which is in separate documentation, obviously the county have produced that, and that's the guidance where the county, obviously they're the highways authority, they have jurisdiction in terms of highway safety. When you're outside of the sort of highway safety element of it, then as members, when you're looking at planning applications, then that is something you can consider, and obviously it's also something for officers to be discussing with applicants through the process. So it's a sort of a double process in terms of what does the policy say, what does the guidance say, and then how does that actually then relate to planning application? Does it impact planning policy, the application itself? But so it's kind of how that slides through the system really, and whether there's any sort of road safety impacts. I suppose the other thing I would just add is, of course, it's when you're looking at car parking and the design of the development, it's not just, it's the land take as a whole as well, and how it's designed, and there is always probably a balance to be made in terms of what the overall take up of land might be and what that looks like in landscape terms, for example.
Councillor Vickers.
Yes, thank you, Catherine. Thank you for that update. As you know, Chairman, we've been talking about this for more years than I care to think about. I noticed at Kilmore Vale there's a lot of signs saying no parking on the street scene, which actually has helped there quite considerably. Can I just ask about the process of a supplementary planning document? Because quite obviously that takes some putting together once the local plan has been agreed. Can members have some input into that supplementary planning document, please?
Certainly, I think is the answer to that. And we can talk about, when we get to that point, I think there's a conversation to be had as officers in terms of how we do that, and what forums we take that through to. But recognise it's an issue that I suspect you're all harangued about, by your constituents, and you know, quite important to people, isn't it? So I think, you know, something we definitely need to make sure that you're all involved with.
Thank you, Catherine. It's an exceedingly sensitive subject. We've all been harangued by it. And, you know, common sense has to prevail as well. And sometimes when you see some of the new developments, you do question the application of any common sense at all, actually, when it comes to the layout of parking and stuff. I think the standards really do need to be revisited. Any other questions, Catherine? Well, thank you very much for that, Catherine. You're quite welcome to stay if you wish, but if you desire, if you wish to go, that's fine by me as well. Thank you very much. Next item on the agenda is the animal welfare policy. I decided to bring it to Overton Scrutiny because it's a new policy, and I thought it would be useful for members to have a look at a new policy compared to some other things which we're not looking at tonight, which are just updates of existing policies, which I didn't deem that important, and thought this would be an opportunity for members to have a look at a new policy as it's being brought in. So I'll hand over to Paul. Oh, sorry, Jay. No.
You might say your colleague's name, and I do apologise.
So any questions on this policy or clarifications? As you can see, there were some questions that were raised by members beforehand, but any other questions? Councillor Vickers?
Just a very simple question. We're responsible for picking up stray dogs, yes? Can you tell me where we take them to once we've actually picked them up?
It's a Tags of Erdon kennel. I'm not entirely sure where it's based specifically, but we have a contract with them who collect them and take them there.
So it's just one particular rescue centre, if you like. Fine, thank you.
It used to be Old Clayton before, but of course they're redeveloping the site, so not anymore. Councillor Circus?
I'm all in favour of animal welfare because I believe that a civilised society is one that protects animal life with sensitivity. So, I mean, I think it's a mark of a civilised country, but I just wonder whether to call this a policy implies that we have changed our approach, which it seems to me that, except in one small respect, we haven't, and that we have powers which in large measure we don't, because these things are governed by statute. I just wonder whether policy is the right word, or whether in fact this is a statement about the situation in respect of animal welfare. I just wonder whether policy implies an activism, if you like, by HDC that it doesn't have to any significant degree, certainly over and beyond the activism that it's always had in relation to the various statutory responsibilities under the various bits of legislation that deal with animal safety.
Thank you, Councillor Circus. Councillor Mercer? Or-
I understand what you're saying, Councillor Circus. I do think it's important to have drawn together these responsibilities so they are clear both to members and to others. Yes, they are largely a collection of statutory responsibilities, but we do have some discretion in the way we go about enforcing them. And the values that are expressed in this sit over the way we might use that discretion. And the example is, of course, that one about tenants. And I'm sure there will be other circumstances in which we will have some discretion to apply statutory situations. And this is intended to fall, to be over that.
Thank you, Councillor Mercer. Any other questions? Councillor Walters.
Thank you, Chair. From a personal point of view, I think it's extremely useful for our residents to see this policy and this bringing together of all our policies in one place. It means that if they do a search, it's all there together and they can read it through and understand it without being referred to this and that and something else, because it is sometimes quite difficult to get through our website. So I welcome this. The other thing is I also welcome the relaxing of the animal ban on emergency accommodation. I've had not personal involvement in this, but through my work, I've been required on several occasions to write letters because children or even adults with mental health issues do need their pets. And that needs to be, the sooner we can revise that policy, the quicker it will benefit our residents in that situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Walters. Any others? Any other questions? No. Thank you. Do you wish to add any comments? Well, thank you for replying to some of the questions. I still think there is a bylaw in place. I've asked people to look at it. I know you said it was under the Dogs Fouling of Land Act 1996, but at the time I was a parish councillor in Southwater, and at the time the diktat came down from district that it was in fact a bylaw that we had to apply across the whole of the parish. And okay, well, Claire's got a long enough memory like mine, and that's why I raised the point about a bylaw, because I still have signs around the place that say dog fouling, big cross with £1,000 fine, which comes from then.
I think the bylaws were rewritten in 2011, so I think they were probably in a previous version. They're not in the current ones on our website.
Sorry, it's the price you pay for having a long-term memory with no problems at the moment yet. Councillor Walters?
Sorry, a couple of other things that have just come to mind. Do we have any responsibility regarding menageries and small holdings? Because I do know that households do apply for small holdings to hold chickens and the occasional donkeys and stuff like that.
I don't know. I'll come back to you on that one.
Thank you.
Any other questions? No? Well, thank you very much for coming and talking to us about it. I hope the comments were helpful, both the ones we sent in advance and the ones that have just come up this time. So thank you both, and thank you, Beth, for coming to join us. Thank you very much. Next item on the agenda is the LGA Governance Peer Challenge, which came in too late really for the last overview and scrutiny meeting to get our heads around it, to read the peer review challenge. Sorry, I'll hand over to the Chief Executive.
Thank you, Chairman. There are two things I want to talk to you about this peer challenge report. And the main one isn't actually about the paper on the agenda. It's about the importance of this committee and its role within the council. And you will see, if you read the whole peer challenge report, which you may or may not have done, that this committee is mentioned a number of times. The reason the government is funding governance peer challenges is because of failures of internal and external challenge within some councils. And many of the councils that have got themselves into financial difficulty have had best value inspections and reports from commissioners that mention this. This doesn't mean that's the sole reason they're in difficulty, because my personal view as someone who's been an accountant in the field for many years is that some of these councils are actually genuinely underfunded. But there is no doubt that many of them also have made some mistakes. So I just want to read you 3 quotes that I pulled out, just to get in your head what it is the government's talking about. The Thurrock Best Value Inspection. Now, Thurrock, if you recall, was the council that invested a lot of money in a solar farm. It says, at Thurrock, internal challenge has been discouraged and external criticism and challenge have been routinely dismissed. This undermined the council's ability to learn from others and from its own previous mistakes. The Slough Best Value Inspection said allied to this was a poor leadership culture, which made it difficult to speak truth to power at both officer and member level. And the Northamptonshire Final Commissioners Report said dissenting voices were ignored, partners were brushed aside if they didn't adhere to the council's view. It is these type of reports that has led DLUC to say that governance peer challenges are one of the types of peer challenges they now fund. They only fund finance, governance and corporate at the moment. These things come and go. There have been other types of peer challenges that come in and you can pay for, but these particular ones are funded by the government. So you might say, why on earth did we then ask for one? Well, we asked for one because we knew there were some issues with the Constitution. I think councillors who've been here for a while will know as well as I do that from time to time we've had problems with working things through the Constitution. We've asked for increases in different bits. We've changed little bits here and there, and we wanted a clean look at it. We wanted an independent view of how that was working. I myself had some concerns about overview and scrutiny over the years I've worked. Before I was in my current role, I was in the role that Dominic takes and used to sit on this committee regularly. It changes with every group of councillors. It changes in its field because it's very much driven by the personality and interests of those councillors. But what I wanted to say to you is you are important. Overview and scrutiny, chairman is almost the second, I believe it is the second post, considered the second post to the leader. The leader leads the cabinet. The chairman of overview and scrutiny is the person who asks the questions, and you ask the questions with that person. That challenge that is lacking in other councils needs to come right through the organisation, but it needs to come here. And it doesn't have to be nasty or bullying or unpleasant. And one of the reasons that when we've looked in the last few months at where challenge in this organisation has died down, some of it is because we're scared of upsetting people. And we don't need to be scared of upsetting people. We need to be careful how we word things so we don't upset people, but that shouldn't stop the questions and it shouldn't stop the challenge. That you will see clearly in this report. So some quotes from the report. The peer team felt that the organisation could benefit from working with members and officers to promote the role of challenge and scrutiny within the council more generally. It then goes on to say, challenge delivered well can lead to growth, improvement and increased resilience. An element of tension in decision making is healthy, and it is possible to challenge in a way that is delivered constructively without losing the positives the council has achieved and the relationships it has built. It also says, it is important that the principal statutory officers, and by the principal statutory officers, that's Dominic's role, my role, and Lauren Kelly's role, the principal statutory officers can assure themselves that they are leading and owning the development of such a culture, enabling candid conversations and promoting the benefits and need for healthy questioning and challenge. That's more directed at the officer level. We know within the officer level, being too nice may be one of our faults. It is recommended that the council look at ways it can empower and support members to question and challenge when appropriate and in a constructive way. So, this report came in absolutely on top of the date of publication. So we didn't have a lot of choice other than to publish pretty much as was. So but we had no reason to go against what the peers were saying because we actually agreed with them. But the most important thing going forward, I feel for you, is making your role have impact, making your role stronger. Stand up and say, we are the Overview and Scrutiny Committee. We wish to ensure that decisions being made by this council are appropriately made and that everyone's thought all the way around it. Because what challenge does is by asking questions, it makes sure we've thought of everything, which usually we know if you do something on your own, you don't. So the report that I've put in front of you tonight is simply taking the recommendations from the Governance Peer Challenge report and saying what we're going to do about them. So the first ones is quite a big rump of the report, really, and it is about what we do with the Constitution and how that is reviewed. And the report recommends a monitoring officer-led review of the Constitution with help from the people who are best able to help. So the suggested working group that will work with Lauren as the head of legal and democratic services, the monitoring officer, is the leader of the opposition, the leader of the Green Party, the chair and vice chair of the governance committee, the chair of overview and scrutiny, and possibly other members where appropriate. We also mentioned the governance officer new role. We're asking for a new role to help Lauren do this work. It's a big piece of work going all the way through that constitution. She also tells me that in her research, there are some more modern constitutions out there that she can base this work on. So that is the first recommendation. And then we go into the recommendation around overview and scrutiny, which is really very much for you to determine the way it goes forward, which is consider a more planned approach to scrutiny in decision making, ensuring scrutiny members take control of the agenda and fully understand their role in challenging rather than noting. So you're not here to say, oh yes, Cabinet, that's fine. You're here to say, oh yes, Cabinet, but have you thought of this, and this? That isn't being hard on Cabinet. Cabinet has set as one of its key objectives, always listening, learning and improving. It wishes to listen, learn and improve from you. And I know I've got 2 Cabinet members here tonight who will agree with me that this is the discussions we've been having with the Cabinet. So these 2 particular areas it needs to look at, you need to look at. One of the recommendations, sort of buried down in the report somewhere, was consider whether overview and scrutiny needs external members. That recommendation was quite a surprise to me. I didn't remember the discussion of that during the process. I do remember talking about external members, and actually that led to Dominic and the chairman of Audit Committee getting in an independent person into Audit Committee, where having an independent member is much more usual. Having an independent member of Overview and Scrutiny, I'm not so familiar with, but it's obviously something that's been suggested. You talk about, you think about it in some of your meetings. You don't have to do it tonight, do it when you feel in a better place and you might want to research it more. And the second one is about training. We need to do more on training generally. We need to do more on training in overview and scrutiny. I will just go on to the end where we've already done some work. So I know the chairman has already undergone a training course himself. As soon as he heard about the review, before he'd even got the report, he went on a course to learn more about overview and scrutiny, and I know he will have something to say about that and how he thinks learning on scrutiny can develop. And also we put this external person onto audit committee. Then the third area was about the performance indicators, and the current administration, since taking power, hasn't yet fully reviewed the performance indicator set. That is widely acknowledged needs to be done. Now, one of you in one of your questions said about, can we be involved? Yes, you can. I don't think anyone's going to argue with that. I'll have a word with the leader and very likely amend this report before it goes to cabinet to say to include overview and scrutiny. You're the people who look at the performance indicators the most, as well as the cabinet members, so we'll probably wish to support them in that role. And then there's some of the stuff about learning from others. We've been doing a number of reviews of our services. So services where we were a bit concerned about performance or where we've had a change of leadership. So we've had people in to do reviews of these services. So property and facilities, obviously, Brian Elliott retired, Liz Williams took over. We thought, well, now's the point to look at this service, get some people in from outside, people who can do comparison. Because one of the weaknesses of spending a lot of your life working for one council, you get to know the council incredibly well, you become very, very strong in the council, but you don't know how somebody else does it. So getting in some consultants to help us with that, we had a very interesting and challenging report on property and facilities, and the action plan on that. It's an awful lot of work for the head of property and facilities, but we believe moves that service forward. There's currently work being done on economic development. Economic development are looking both at the policy of economic development, but also on the way we do economic development. Because some of us who have worked in other councils have said, well, in economic development, a team of this size is unusual. Are we delivering unusually large amounts of economic development? Not sure we are. So this is looking at what are we doing, what is it we're working on, is it the right somethings? So the right work, the right structure being looked at. An external comparison of communities. We've got a new head of communities coming in. We've got quite a lot of people in communities were funded actually during COVID from COVID money. Contracts coming to an end relatively soon. So a review of communities and the work that needs to be done in communities. And that compared to other, again, our communities team is large compared to others. They do a lot compared to others. Is this something the council wishes to continue its commitment to, or does it want to think about that? It certainly wants to think about it. Which way it wants to think, I don't know. And then there is this whole thing about reviewing the performance indicator set. And then the next part is the member development. So bear in mind, when this review was done, what were we, 7-8 months into a new council where I think it was 58% of the councillors were new to being councillors. And we sheep dipped you, didn't we, in a vast amount of induction training. And then apart from planning, haven't done a great deal since. I'm very keen that you take some leadership to say what you need. I've got far more councillors coming to me now saying, can I go on a course on? I think some of you have discovered some of the very excellent courses that the LGA do up at Warwick. I've been to Warwick myself. The officer ones are very good. I believe the member ones are also very good. Obviously, cost comes into it, probably sending all 48 up there would be a little bit pricey, but there are ways of learning. There's a lot of online material on the LGA, and for you, you've got the Centre for Public Scrutiny as well, whose focus is on scrutiny, and they work very closely with the LGA on the way forward. So I'm really interested in how we can work together and with the Cabinet member to move this forward. So some of these comments say, oh, Cabinet member for this, Cabinet member for that. I don't expect it to be just the Cabinet member, and maybe I haven't written enough in here to say plus overview and scrutiny. But I think that these matters need you to look at. Then in terms of the matters that we've already addressed, as I said, well, the first one was informal. Cabinet didn't put their ideas enough onto the agenda. We always ask informal Cabinet for their ideas on the agenda for when we're going to have a discussion. If you want to talk about something, Cabinet members, I hope you both feel that here tonight you can say, I want to talk about, and we put it on there. Statutory officers can assure themselves they are leading, owning the development of a culture enabling candid conversations and promoting the benefits and the needs for healthy questioning and challenge. I did a presentation to the heads of service. They said, please take it to the whole manager group. I had a whole manager group this morning, which was particularly well attended, and they sat and listened. We've yet to see how well they get on with it. Some of us, of course, like Dominic and I, are natural challengers, and we can ask questions. Paul's another one, forever if you want. Others find it much harder both to take and to give. And we've talked to officers as well. We do some personality analysis from Thomas Diskman, and a very common personality type among our officers actually is people who are steady and compliant. It goes with the sort of professions we have. If you're very heavily based in a profession, you find challenge quite hurtful. And we've talked about that. So we're trying to get across these messages to people. And I mean, it sits very much with the three of us sitting in a row here, doing a lot of this work. But we are moving it forward. And I hope this action plan, although it doesn't have a lot of detail in it, it's got a lot of work in it. It's going to need a lot of work to deliver this. We're targeting the new constitution for next April so that it's in before the next year. Bradley, who's sitting there sagely nodding at me, is going to be involved in this work and doing a lot of the research for it. So I'm happy to take any further questions. I'm happy to take any ideas of anything else you'd like to see us write into this action plan. Thank you.
Councillor Kitchen.
Yes, thank you for doing that. I have to admit I did read the whole thing, which is highly unusual for me. But I thank you for your robust telling us all about it and your thoughts on it, which I entirely agree with. The one thing that did worry me when I read it was the applications team. Is there any, I think we've all been aware of the fact that they are clearly vastly overworked at the moment. Is there any way that they could be helped in the shorter term to get through some of the concerns and worries that I suspect they themselves have? Not helped, I believe, by the IT, which we know is a problem here.
I think with regards to the planning applications team, I think that's probably caught up more in the review by the Planning Advisory Service of specific issues within the planning applications team. I think if you've more questions on that, you're probably better to speak to Em Parks, who's been working with her team on what they're going to do. Dominic and I have seen the action plan. They are taking the usual sort of approach to any backlog, which is you try and segregate. You have your team that do backlog and you have your team that do the incoming work, so it doesn't get worse. We have got more staff because we got the government grant from all staff, So we both have more staff, and I believe we've got more coming in. So there is, and the planning management are signed up to moving forward on this. So there is a plan, and they are working on that. Thank you. That's very good news.
Thank you, Jane. Any other questions, Councillor Livingston?
Yeah, one of my interests on planning is the competency. Now, I've had two problems myself personally with the competency in regard to planning applications with regard to the officers. And I believe another councillor brought up an issue. We've had to issue addendums just before planning committee meetings where basic points have been missed. We've had, one of my problems was on the last planning meeting where we had to have some sort of high court order to actually bring it to the committee because officers had ignored my request to bring it to committee. So I would like to look at how we manage the competency of these officers. Thank you.
I would say that I understand the concerns, and I think the Chief Executive will take that on board. But what we're actually looking at the moment in terms of the agenda is the governance peer challenge, which is different from the planning one. So I think the Chief Executive will take that away as a question and deal with it and come back to you, Councillor Livingston. But if we could just stay on the meat of the topic, which is the governance peer challenge, which meant interesting, and it was certainly a challenge. But anyway, Councillor Walters.
Yes, thank you, Chair. One of the things that within the NHS that we have is obviously we have the CQC, and there's a requirement for all staff to go through a certain amount of training. And I had that in my insurance world as part of the requirement to make sure you're up to date with all the insurance law and everything. I've been here some time, and it's not something that I felt was there for me, as in, so even if it's just CBT online, whatever, or a list of training where I can just plug into it, and I would absolutely welcome that. And I think a lot of the other members would too. And if it's something that we can do and advertise, I don't know where, but somewhere that we can just go through those lists and say, yep, today I want to focus on X, Y, or Z, and be able to do that at the comfort of our own home, or even come in and do it here. But I think if we could have a list of training opportunities, then that would be really, really welcome. Thank you.
Just to come back on that, the LGA does have a councillor competency framework that you can work your way through, and it does have a lot of work, a lot of training, online training and so on that you can pick up through that. And I mean, these are some of the things I'd like to look at, ideally with a group of councillors. I did ask for volunteers some time ago, and nobody actually came back to me. I think it was in the members' newsletter, which maybe means you don't actually read it, some of you, if you were desperate to do so. But I will be working with Dominic will as well, with the cabinet member, to try and get him to encourage some more of you to get involved. It'd be great if I can see Claire looking at me, if some of our longer serving councillors, as well as some of our newer councillors, because our newer councillors may know what they don't know, but some of our longer serving ones may know better what they need to know. So it'd be great if I could get a real mixture of councillors involved in this.
Councillor Walters.
Yeah, I'll be very happy to get involved in that.
Councillor Trollope.
I'm sort of testing the water with my own understanding, but I think this is within scope. One of the, it sort of aligns a little bit with training, but it's also, we've made several references to, have you read this and has this been read? And I've read this in full. I have noted in my year of doing this so far that a lot of the documents, although the English is well written and grammatically, thank God, correct, because it really annoys me when it's not. I do find the formatting quite clumsy, very often, especially on these wonderful devices. And I do find as well, it would be really useful at times just to have summaries, upfront summaries that are easily found and easily scanned on a thing where you can then delve into the detail. I find myself very often wading through a lot of verbiage to get to something useful to read. And I'm not good. I think maybe it's a skill that comes with time as being a councillor or an officer, of knowing how to navigate the waffle that is in a lot of our documents. And pages left intentionally blank, I've never really understood that one. I don't know why do we have pages left intentionally blank? I mean, also, it's just purely, I think you guys must know that we read these on these devices that you gave us that I really dislike, but here we are. I have to continually expand the text and then move it with my finger and then move it down. It's just clumsy and irritating. So I used to be a designer, and I used to be a copywriter, and I used to be a technical writer. The documents seem designed for paper, yet I somehow then slammed onto this. Whereas I think you have to, particularly if you don't want us to print, could we start designing the documents to be read on these devices? Yeah? And if this is not the right place to have mentioned all of that, I'm very sorry, but I think it is. And that's my, sorry,
I think there's several points in there. One is about the way we write English. And my colleagues who write these reports are very well educated. They've nearly all got master's degrees in some incredibly technical subject, and some of them write some incredibly technical reports. And sometimes Dom and Sam and I have a little sigh when we see one coming, because we know we're going to have to wade our way through it. So some of it is about the way we write. I even have disagreements with the odd head of service about whether we should use plain English or not. I'm a big advocate. Some of my colleagues say they hate it, which is somewhat frustrating, to me anyway. The presentation on here, I'm less confident about how much we can change, because we use modern.gov. Everybody in local government uses modern.gov as far as I'm aware. I mean, I'm not an IT expert, but I'm not sure there's another option. I think you might be able to change some of the layout of the committee report, although all those funny bits at the end about implications you have to do for legal reasons. And you may not want to read all of them, although I probably shouldn't say that. But I certainly take the point that some of these reports could be clearer, particularly some of the technical ones.
The Modern Gov app, I've sort of gotten used to. That's not, navigating from document to document is fine. I'm talking more, the point I was making is more about reading the actual document. It's if you print it out, it looks beautiful. It's nicely formatted, it's in 2 columns, and that works well, and it's designed for paper. I think what we need to do is we need to agree that most of the documents, particularly when we don't want to print as much on paper, needs to be redesigned to be read on a screen. That means avoiding having to go left and right and maximizing the text. It's about making it look good on this device, or any computer device, in fact.
I think the chief executive has taken the point, but we've
I wasn't
wandered
sure.
off the agenda again, and if we can come back to the LG, to the peer review. So, Dennis?
Just make a quick point about it. I review a lot of strategy documents, a lot of paperwork every week. The way we do it is we have an executive summary at the start of every document, which basically gives a summary, which my colleague is talking about, and it tells you what's going to be in that document, so you can pick out there what you need to review. Now, these things will never sort of suit from most of these documents, whatever we do, but an executive summary will indicate what we need to read far better.
Thanks, man. I think the chief executive got the point. Councillor Mercer? No, I would agree with you. Any other comments or questions? Councillor Circus?
Yeah, I think Jay's absolutely right. One of the things we've got to do very seriously is when we get to the constitution review, we've got to look very seriously at particularly the role of PDAGs. The role of PDAGs, Jay, if I can through you, we ended up with PDAGs because when the law allowed us to revert to the committee system from the cabinet model, we looked into it and decided to retain the cabinet system, but there was a lot of pressure from a lot of backbenchers that we should return to the committee system for the very reason you mentioned. Although ironically, when we set up the PDAG system, it was largely those members who never turned up to PDAGs, but we won't go into that. But it means we've got this strange animal that the peer review team didn't know what to make of, called PDAGs. And it was basically, perhaps SOP is not quite the right term to use, but it was designed to address the concerns of non-cabinet members of the majority group who felt that we should go some way, almost a hybrid system, if you like, some of the features of the cabinet system with some of the features of the committee system. I think you're absolutely right to say how difficult challenge can actually be. I was involved, in fact, there was a wish by Scrutiny that I was the chairman of a investigation we did into side loader refuse vehicles. Well, that was a catastrophic blunder by the council. And we ended up with a scathing report. And the leader, I had the leader leaning on me very considerably to ameliorate didn't want the report to be as condemnatory of the administration as it inevitably was. And one of the worst aspects, we ploughed ahead, it was published, it was publicised in the local paper, but I had members of staff who told me to my face I was being disloyal by criticising members and officers impliedly, that I was being, and we were being disloyal to the staff and disloyal to the authority. And that, for a really powerful piece of scrutiny, that's the sort of risk you run. If I could just say, I think Jane has mentioned the idea of having an independent member. I think that's a profoundly bad idea. And I think it's a profoundly bad idea because that independent member would be perceived and probably feel themselves to lack democratic legitimacy. And so if they were going to take a significant role in challenging the administration, I think they would feel a certain limitation in terms of their lack of democratic legitimacy. And I think other members of Scrutiny would feel that they lack democratic legitimacy. I think what is important is, and I think our decision making is improved when we do it, is to visit other local authorities. There's nothing like visiting other local authorities, talking to members, talking to officers, and seeing how they operate. We did it in relation to the last review of the Constitution, and I hope very much we'll do it in relation to this review of the Constitution. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Circus. Councillor Walters?
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to go back to the language that they used in reports. So I'd like to go back to the language that we use in reports. I will be very brief. I myself fall under the Disability Discrimination Act as part of the Equality Act, and I would strongly advocate using plain English where possible in our reports, or do a plain English summary. And the reason for that is all these reports go out into the public domain. And when I was in my training role years ago, we were always told to write for the lowest common denominator as the sun reader. And I'm not putting down their residents, but I'm putting down for people like me who have difficulty reading long paragraphs and lots of complicated words and things like that. So I would fully advocate plain English where possible, in a summary, if not in the technical report, understanding that technical items have to be technical, but maybe that could be somewhere else in the report, really. Thank you.
Again, any other comments or questions? I must admit, I don't find the reports particularly difficult to read, so I find it hard to get. But
Far more experience than me, sir.
it's okay. I mean, the independent person for overall scrutiny, I have an open mind. I'm quite happy to discuss, and we'll explore that option. I mean, my only comment is for audit, it made sense, absolute sense, because the independent person is a professional person and basically brings that gravitas to the committee, which, let's face it, most councillors are amateurs when it comes to audit and finance, put it bluntly, whether you like it or not. And so it made sense. Some people have got financial backgrounds, but a lot of them don't. Possibly on audit, people who are put on audit have the background or have some knowledge, but fine. My comment on learning and education of overall scrutiny is that certainly the sheep dip, I think you said, a sheep wash, a sheep dip that you said, in my opinion, wasn't very good. And I don't think it did come across to the newer members in particular how good and how powerful overall scrutiny can be and what overall scrutiny should do. Certainly the course I went on, which was 2 days of intensive course, certainly opened my eyes, actually, and I had 4 years of experience, 5 years of experience of overall scrutiny committee. It certainly opened a lot of things for me and educated me. So we might look at that and do a course either online or in person. I'm quite happy to discuss that with members and also with the chief executive, and I'd like to do that. And one of the fundamental issues before we can go forward with looking at the structure of overall scrutiny is we have to decide how the PDAGs fit into it. And it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation. And Philip's explained the reasons for the PDAGs, and I think that we have to consider that aspect of other backbenchers of whatever political persuasion. Most councillors want to participate, some don't, but the ones who want to participate often don't have the opportunity or the experience to do that. I think we need to be cognizant of that. So if there are any other questions for the Chief Executive, I'll draw this segment to a close. Any last minute questions for the Chief Exec? No? Thank you, Jane, for doing that. And we will be talking again, no doubt. Next item on the agenda, and thank you, Mark, for sitting through all of this. I hope it wasn't too boring. I hope it was interesting. This is the Transformation Fund and Productivity Plan, 24-25. So update Cabinet report. I'll hand over to you, Mark, and to Don.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair. So you have before you the draft paper, which I intend to submit to Cabinet in a couple of weeks' time. And you'll notice that it begins with an executive summary.
In plain English?
Executive summary, 2 words. Okay, so the genesis of this is that it comes from a letter that we received from the Minister for Local Government back in April, which was asking us, how can we show how impressively efficient we are, and how can we improve our efficiency, and how can we reduce wasteful spending, and a load of other things. In fact, this comes under 4 separate headings, and you actually had the letter as an appendix to the paper, but there are actually a lot of questions behind that. In terms of how we're tackling this, well, we thought we'd actually put it together with tackling the transformation fund, because so much of what we do in terms of looking at improved efficiency and productivity measures involves transforming our processes. And for that, we have a fund that assists us to do so. And so the first bit of it, just to get that one out of the way, is asking council, going to be asking council, or asking cabinet to approve transfer from the general fund reserve to the earmarked reserve of 135,000, 135,500. Essentially, that tops it up to 500,000, which is what we've been doing year on year. So I don't think that's particularly controversial. It's just moving it from one part of the reserve to another part of the reserve, in fact. So the second part of it is around responding to the government minister. And you'll see that there's a number of, if you look at paragraph 3.5 onwards, you'll see this is our response. So the first one is how you've transformed the way you design and deliver services, make better use of resources. And we put together there some examples of good management at both a micro and a macro level, and how we're looking to actually improve various aspects of efficiency. And then that's taken on further in the second part when we talk about the use of technology. I mean, if Don wants to say anything beyond this, then I'll invite him to at the end, through you, Chair. So we're looking, he's giving some examples there of how we're using data to improve the way we interact and actually get through the day-to-day business, if you like. I'll come to the third question last, actually. The fourth one was around the barriers to preventing progress. And you've heard from Dom earlier this evening talking about the lack of having a funding certainty. It is a real barrier, and it causes us, you know, when we sit down and say, okay, let's work out the budget, well, we don't know how much we're going to get. When are we going to know? Well, probably the end of December, but we don't know that because they don't, yeah, and it's just very difficult. So I think that's a good point, well made. And then the other one, which was under 3, was our plans to reduce wasteful spend within our organisation and expenditure. I was actually very sorely tempted to scrub out this whole answer completely and write in it said, stop responding to nonsensical questionnaires such as these, which are going to go straight into a government black hole in the department, never to be seen again, together with hundreds of others from the other ones around the country. But you know, sort of wiser heads probably prevailed, and that probably wouldn't be very tactful. So we do have examples here about how we review the budgets every year, and in fact we put them to. We mentioned overview and scrutiny in here as part of that process, because it's not about, you know, Jane's perfectly right. I'm very happy to be overviewed and scrutinised by by a group of people for whom it's going to make some difference and have some effect.